Okay, and we'll just gather with our prayer on page 184. Give me again the joy that comes from your salvation, and make me willing to obey you. Then I will teach sinners your commands, and they will turn back to you. Amen. Hey, that was probably one of my least favorite videos, but that's okay. I don't know why I even said that. Bishop Max is a lovely guy. So let me start as always and see what either the video or the reading or the text or is doing for you as you read over the past 2 weeks.
Well, this I'll mention something in these readings. We're kind of told over and over that the disciples just really didn't get it until after the death and resurrection and what Jesus was up to. He keeps telling them, this is what's going to happen, and they kind of don't get it. And but these readings help. When I had these Bible studies, I too learn more that I didn't see before, and think, well, I'm just like the disciples, I don't really get it. So, it takes me reading Luke multiple times or whatever, and an example of that was the parable of the tenants, where the owner of the land has several tenants farming the land for him, and then he comes to collect, after the growth, and they rebuke a couple of his servants, and then finally he sends his son, and they kill his son. And then the owner then has them killed, I guess, and gives the land to other people who can, if you will, inherit the kingdom of God. And then this is the first time I've seen that parable. Sometimes you just read these parables and go, okay, he's telling a story about himself. He is the son who's killed, and it's only then given to others to inherit the kingdom of God. So I thought that was, I never had read that parable. At least that's the way I read it this time. Yeah. That way before that's just his story itself. So I found that interesting, and just reminds me that reading it once isn't enough. And we go through, I think, as we mature, various levels of understanding.
So can I ask you a follow-up question? Because you mentioned that parable, which is, I'm just going to say for me, like I get the allegorical reading, but it's also kind of an odd story. Maybe the oddity I want to name right is like, hey, if you send your servants and they beat them up, like, why would you send your child?
Yes.
What were you thinking?
Yes. Right? Why did you think? Yes.
Yeah, but it occurs to me more and more that sometimes we read these stories as like, oh, that's a cool fact pattern and that's a great description. And sometimes we miss what godly play does. Godly play always asks, where are you in the story?
Yeah.
So, I don't want you to feel like this is an invasive question, but where are you in that story?
Well, I'm one of the land or tenants, I guess.
Would you say why? Why would you put yourself there?
Well, I see the son as Jesus, and the owner is the father. So there's not many other people left in that story, I guess. And but it's just kind of telling me I can be one of the original tenants, or I can be one of the new ones that the owner chooses. So
you could be one of the messengers.
That's true too. Yeah, you're right. I don't know. I think I see myself as a tenant. It's in a foot in, let's say, kind of a foot in both the new and the old, if you will.
Fair. So is it okay to say, it seems like when I read the story, the mistake of the tenants is they start to think the stuff is theirs.
Yes.
They're doing the work, and this often happens. Like when you work hard at something, you start to think like it's yours, when really it's not theirs. They're stewards of the stuff, and they've confused their labor with owning. Right. And this is why they start to think well, look, there's an absentee landlord and we're doing all the work, so we're just going to keep the stuff. Right. Does do you find yourself in that narrative, or do you find like a different narrative for you as you think about being one of those tenants?
No, I think that's right on. I mean, we see ourselves as these are our possessions. Well, they're not our possessions; they're God's. And we forget that. Oh, that's one of the biggest sins I think we make.
I see, like that we confuse like God's gifts with our ownership.
Yes.
So can I run a line by you? My mother-in-law said, she said this a bunch of times actually, that she was really convinced from her first child to her fourth that these were not her children. They were like on loan to her. These were essentially God's kids. And she was, of course, like physically their mother, but really what she was is like their divine caretaker. Does that resonate with you as a father figure?
Probably never have. I've heard you tell that story before, and probably haven't exactly looked at it like that. But I mean, but there's probably truth to that. Some truth in there. These are God's children too. So.
I mean, I can tell you, like, I don't know that I view my own kids that way. Like figuratively, like, I get it, but I'm not sure that would be my core story for being a dad.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it would be easier to say like, well, it'd be easier to have like appropriate attachment if that were my core story. Usually I'm like, no child of mine is going to do this thing. This is like when I'm parenting at my worst, just to be clear. Ellen, you look like you're going to hop in.
I think that just brought up a thought to me that as I was raising my children and when they were infants and young, I didn't think about them as being God's children and a gift for me to shepherd. But I certainly did at times when I had to turn over my control of my child to God's care, knowing that I couldn't help and couldn't do anything. And I was very aware of pleading with God to watch over and care for her. So I think that was a really illuminating moment.
Thank you. Darlene?
Ellen, that really resonates with me. My first thought was, God is in control. I am not. I cannot fix this. I cannot. The outcome is totally up to God. And I can remember with Jamie, my son, who was totally out of control, totally out of anybody's control, much less mine, and just being so distraught and literally in prayer, lifting my hands as if I were holding, he was a young adult at the time, but the infant, giving him back to God. Take him, do something with him. I can't do it.
Yeah.
It's up to you. And just totally, almost physically, I had the sense of physically handing him to God. Just totally depleted. And for there's some hope in that for me. Yeah. There was some hope in that for me, that what I couldn't do, perhaps God, I knew God could, but I didn't know if it was within the realm of what was supposed to happen. So there was hope, but no expectation of the outcome.
I appreciate that last line. I with my during my difficult teenage years, I tried a similar strategy, but to be honest, I didn't get the fulfillment I was looking for out of that.
Right, I didn't either.
Yeah.
It was not my outcome, but part of my prayer was, let me accept what does happen.
Yeah.
Be with me in the acceptance of what does happen.
Yeah. I have to say with my second kid too, you know, like, and I think it makes a real difference how they come into your life and where you are, right? And I'll say, like, one of the things that my son was deprived of, which is unfortunate for him, right, is that like we had these like infant memories with our girl, you know, and like there's actually like chemicals that come with babies that don't come with 6-year-olds, you know, like they just don't, you know, and I've got these tender memories of my daughter doing skin on skin contact, right? Because that's what you do with an infant, but we didn't do that with the 6-year-old who we just met like kind of coldly, you know. And I feel a tremendous sense of loss that my son A didn't get that, B didn't get it from me, right? Because that's just hard to not have that moment with your kid. But then I had this other moment with my daughter where, like, and you've probably said this before, and this maybe says more about my own spirituality. So I'm not sure where I fall in with the tenets here. It's like, it was really clear, even from an early age, that like, I could mess this up really bad. You know, like I'm looking at this kid and I'm like, you know, there's really nowhere to go but down. I am not going to improve on this child. Like at best, I'm going to like support this kid, but I'm probably going to mess it up. And so like, I don't know what kind of tenant that makes me. I was like kind of like the cautious and scared tenant, like, do not mess this up. Instead of like, hey, I've got a lot of contributions I can make, you know, like it's like a different, I don't know, it's like a different story. So I don't know where I don't know where I am in this story either.
Well, Herb, I related to what you said too, because I don't see myself as one of the messengers, which speaks a lot to our Episcopalian resistance to evangelism.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know, and I think this whole chapter was about the sending out and sharing the good news but when I think about being the one to the messenger to go back to the landowners or the tenants, it's a scary thought. It's like, I don't know how to do this. I don't know. It's like, I don't want to. It's way out of my comfort zone, you know. But it also struck me that with all of these parables, somebody would ask Jesus a question and he would turn it into a teaching moment instead of answering the question. Like, he never did answer the question that was asked. He like turned it totally around. And I really appreciated reading that and trying to remember to look for the teaching moments in different experiences and situations.
I appreciate that response, Ellen. I've just been sort of thinking, like, when you give a direct answer, like, what do you do with that? You either say like, oh, you're right, or like, I disagree, right? So there's usually one of two things you can do. But when you tell a story that's got tension in it, you can return to that story over and over and over again and like start to resonate or resist or grow with the story, right? I mean, a lot of the answers that we get in Holy Week from Jesus, in some ways, they're like non-answers, you know, like you can do whatever you want with them. Give to Caesar what's Caesar's and give to God what's God's, right? And then that begs the question, like, what is Caesar's and like, what is God's? And like, are we just stewards or do we actually own stuff, right? I mean, like but I don't think Jesus tells you the answer to that question. Like, it's like the Socratic method, right? And what's interesting is Jesus, like Socrates, gets accused of perverting the nation, right? Corrupting the youth of Athens, or corrupting, you know, the teachings of Judaism in Jerusalem. Like, they're kind of parallel charges. And if you read, like, we don't have anything Socrates wrote, it's all through Plato, right? But really, like, Socrates didn't teach anything. He just kept asking questions. So I don't know that Jesus is like the new Socrates or anything like that, but in some ways, I'm like, instead of the parables being like a pithy answer, I wonder if they don't enlarge the question for us.
It also occurs to me that oftentimes I'm not aware of the fact that I'm sharing a witness because I'm just having conversation with a friend, and maybe I relate an experience or something that's happened to me. And sometimes there are new things that I haven't thought of in years, but in sharing that information, then it encourages further conversation and sharing our beliefs in that way.
That's a good point. I think we're kind of left with this guilt complex about it, but I think we evangelize just by example sometimes too, and by leadership or whatever else. And that I learned because someone came to me one time and says, "I'm in this church because of you," and I thought, I don't remember, what I said or what I did, but I think we're always out there as disciples and examples, and even if we don't know it, the life we live. And you're a good example of that, Ellen.
A great example. Well, I think that's where it's helpful to say, like, it's not like we're only one character in this story. It's really possible that we find ourselves playing all the different roles at the same time, right? I think like part of it is in the Episcopal Church, and certainly in the South, right? We have this way of like being self-deprecating. So like, well, I'm not going to be one of those messenger people. But I think the truth is we're all messengers, whether the content of the message are up to us. But, when you sort of identify either as Christian or like with a place like St. Thomas, you're a message bearer, right? Like whatever we do is a message, right? And so sometimes I feel like I probably give better messages than others, but the truth is we are messengers.
Yeah, and evangelism, I think, is not just about growing the numbers. It's about maturing those who are there, helping. If we help each other mature and grow in Christ, then we are evangelists, I think.
So I'm really grateful for you saying that, because particularly when we talk about a vineyard, right? Like the producing the most wine is a strategy, but then there's also like a different strategy of like aging and refining and like developing complexity, both in the the vineyard, the fruit, and in the wine itself, right? And so like sometimes I do think there's a point of evangelism where we're able to say like, hey, that news you've heard is just too simplistic, like it doesn't hold up in this simple state for me. It means a lot of different complicated things for me. It's sort of like refining the wine product. And sometimes it's like, well, shoot, I'm defeating the whole enterprise by doing this because now I've introduced complexity. But like that actually is a mark of sophistication in the wine industry.
That's a pretty good parable.
I wish I thought of that earlier when I was supposed to preach on it, but it seems like a good one, right?
We're not just interested in $2 Chuck bottle of wine, huh?
I mean, there's times for that. Let's be clear, right? And you look, there's such a thing as table wine, and I don't care how wealthy you are. There's table wine, and then there's like special occasion wine. But if you confuse the two, that might not be great. And I did go to a conference with this guy, Brian McLaren, who's like this, he's one of these like kind of new vision for Christianity people. And he was talking about evangelism and like how difficult it can be, because sometimes like we have a lot of ambiguity in our own faith life. So like, how do we convey that, and also not turn people off because we don't know. And basically one of the things he said is like, hey, if we would just like take the pains of saying like, I'm doing this thing because like my church life means a lot to me, then people know that. And if they want to ask you, then they know that they can. And maybe that's all it takes, is just identifying as a person of faith. And then they can ask when they want to. But if we don't identify, they don't know how to ask. And if we over-identify, then it's sort of like you, other person, are a means to an end, right? Which has to do with like my evangelical efforts or my relations, my accruing good works or something like that, instead of like, hey, I love you no matter what you are. And part of the reason I love you is I'm a person of faith.
I think another side of evangelism doesn't involve words. I think sometimes we worry about, oh, I don't know what to say. I can't do that because I don't have the right words, the right phrases. I won't get it right. But for me, evangelism has a lot to do with just presence, who we are, carrying the Spirit, carrying the compassion, the love that can radiate from us, so that others feel it. And to me, that avoids the controversy, that avoids the conflict or the back and forth. And I enjoy back and forth, but and I think it's important. I think words are important, but also just being willing to be who we are with others who need to feel the presence of what we bring.
And I think what you said is great, right? Like you can't really feel things that aren't embodied, because feeling is embodied, right? And so like, I think this is a great reminder that any kind of evangelism that's simply cognitive cannot be felt, because it's disembodied.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, sir. Thanks for being willing to chase that rabbit. Ellen or Darlene, anything stand out for you?
Let's see.
I think one of the things that bothered me a little bit was in the book on page 87, where he talks about, he makes the statement, well, quotes, I guess, Luke, Satan entered into Judas.
Yeah.
And this talk about the witnesses wanted us to know that evil's power always stands ready. Satan can enter into our thoughts and actions. I'm not sure where I am with that. Satan as an entity doesn't, I don't connect with that concept.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying it's not there, it's not real. I'm just saying I'm not there with it.
Mm-hmm. So what if we read that not as a personal name, but as the word accusation? And I would say, as much as I want to resist the idea of like red impish beings possessing people, boy, I can be possessed by accusation in a second.
Yes. And I have to guard against that.
Yeah, I mean, and to be mindful of it, right? And like a lot of times I don't even know I'm doing it, because I've got this view of the world, and so when something doesn't fit with it, it's probably wrong. And it's interesting to look at Andrew Lloyd Webber's depiction. Well, really, Tim Rice wrote the script, right? Like in Jesus Christ Superstar, that actually, like, Judas might have thought he was helping Jesus fulfill his mission. And there's been a couple of people who do this, like forcing Jesus's hand to take up arms and be this Messiah, you know? And I mean, the truth is we don't know. We don't know, because we don't get like a inner dialogue with Judas. But the turnaround story, at least in Mark, I'm stepping outside of Luke, is when that lady pours a year's worth of wages on Jesus's head, and Judas is like, what the hell? That was a year's worth of money. And Jesus is like, well, the poor you'll always have with you, but you won't always have me. And I have to admit, when I read that, I'm like, whoa, like at face value, that's like, I'm not sure I subscribe to that teaching. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that's what's really interesting is like sometimes we've already pre-decided whose side we're going to take. So like, oh, Judas must be wrong and he must be like greedy. Like in the Gospel of John, you get this addition that Judas kept the purse and he helped himself to it. I mean, you don't have that in the other three, though. I'm not saying John's wrong. You don't know that, right? And so, I mean, I have to admit, like that's a tough scene for me. But maybe Jesus is not talking at face value, right? Like that quote, "The poor you'll always have with you," comes out of the book of Deuteronomy. And it says, like, because you're tight-fisted and you don't share with your neighbor, the poor you will always have with you. So open your hand and be generous, and for me, it makes me wonder, like I still find myself being very Spartan when I give aid to people, like, hey, you're hungry, so you'll be grateful for what I give you. If you're really hungry, you'll eat these Vienna sausages that like I would never eat, and you'll say thank you. And it's sort of like, well, that's why there's poor people in the land, because you're greedy and you try to control your gifts. So what if you actually said, like, here's what I have to give you. It's okay if you don't enjoy it. Or what would you like? In those times. Or instead of giving you my hand-me-downs, like, what if I gave you something new? Because the truth is, right, like I wouldn't give my daughter a can of Vienna sausages because I know she wouldn't eat them. I would say, like, like there'd be a conversation about what she'd like, which is probably candy, and what I'm comfortable with, which is not candy, but not Vienna sausages. You know what I mean? Like, so like I think and maybe I'm trying to get Jesus off the hook by saying he's asking a deeper question, and that could be. But I do think it's fair that to read that Judas gets real turned off, and what he ends up doing in Mark anyway is he agrees to hand Jesus over for a tithe on 300 denarii. He does it for 30, which is a tithe. What he's going to do with that money, we don't know. It's like he may not keep it. He might actually do what he'd hoped, which is like give it to poor people. I mean, we don't know.
We do know what he did with it.
He felt really bad and he threw it back, right? And they bought the field of blood with it.
Yeah, he bought the land, I think, and I think you could say killed himself, huh?
Yeah, that shows up in Luke. And when you read some of the New Testament pseudepigrapha, he has like gout and he's like full of worms and like he hangs himself, but his guts spew out, and he's got like genital parasites. Like, I mean, there's a whole lot of like really gross torture for the guy.
Yeah.
Ooh. I think my previous understanding was that he did throw away the money and hung himself.
Yeah, and like I think I learned that like that means he's going to hell, because if you kill yourself, you're going to hell. Like I think I learned that doctrine, but like, wow, talk about a lack of compassion for a guy that Jesus included at the Last Supper, right? I mean, like, that's the interesting thing is like purportedly Jesus knows what Judas is going to do and includes him.
And I think he had to have had a lot of good qualities. I think Jesus would not have included him in the disciples if he didn't have potential, if he didn't have character, if he didn't have what Jesus was looking for. And to me, there's just a fatal flaw, which a lot of us have. Good people, we're not all good or all bad.
Right. Or even stronger, maybe Jesus was the patron saint of lost causes.
okay.
Which like you think about being invited into that way of life. I don't know if I want to take that invitation. Is it okay to comment on this, on just one thing that, Luke does? They all, a couple of the gospel writers do this. They ask Pilate to release somebody, to release a captive, and there's no way that happened. I just want to be really clear. That's like gospel fiction, because the only people you crucify are people who are insurrectionists, like members of Al Qaeda, or like people who plot the Oklahoma City bombing, and like you're not going to turn them back out. You just, that's not something you do. And I mean, maybe this really happened, but most scholars are like, this is maybe doing something beyond the literal level, because the guy they ask for is called Barabbas, which means son of the father. So what most people say is like, they ask for the wrong son of the father. The guy they want is the active, convicted insurrectionist, instead of the guy who says, you say I'm the son of God. I didn't say that. It's sort of an interesting and ironic foil is how a lot of scholars read that incident. And it might, for me, like the way it plays out, there's these books like Jesus, the Great CEO, and like Jesus, the, how to run your business, Jesus style, and stuff like this. It's like, oh, like that's Barabbas. Like that's who we're asking for, is like the one who does things the way we want them done. You get a lot of these stories, like, I don't know if you've read the Brothers Karamazov, the Dostoevsky book, where Jesus actually becomes incarnate again during the Spanish Inquisition. And the Grand Inquisitor like knows it's Jesus and puts him to death, because Jesus is going to muck up the whole like church. It's like, I know this is a scathing commentary, but like in the middle of like the what would Jesus do bracelet thing, like the question is like, well, really, what would he do? And like, if Jesus were incarnate today, would we recognize him? Would we be glad to see him? Or would it be like, hey, you got like some weird ideas, like we kind of know what we're doing here? I like to think I would get it right, but the guys who actually live with him didn't get it right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like every gospel portrays the disciples as just buffoons, right? Like they just like they don't understand at all. And like it's a lot of hubris, I think, to say like those guys are dumb. Like they live with him and like physically knew him, and they didn't understand. So like, wow, we probably have a lot to learn.
And they kept saying, explain to us, teach us, tell us. So they knew that there was something more to Jesus than they were getting, it seems to me.
Yeah.
Particularly, during their time of walking with him.
I mean, case in point, right? Peter says, you're the Messiah, the Son of God. And then Jesus says, hey, you're right. Now get behind me, accuser. Which is like, oh, okay. And then he goes and denies, and that wasn't enough. He goes and denies him 3 times, right? But we like to think we'd get it right the first time. Like it's this interesting story.
The video talked about the Holy Spirit illuminated their minds.
Yeah.
I've never thought of it in that way. And Herb, you were talking about reading scripture multiple times and sometimes getting something out of it, and then the next time something else. Mm-hmm. And I don't think about that as the Holy Spirit illuminating my mind. That happens to me too. I usually think about it as I'm at a different place in my life, or a different place in my development. And I'm able to see things differently from a different perspective. And I'm not saying it's not the Holy Spirit doing it. I'm just saying, I've never thought about that. It's a new concept for me, or a different concept.
Well, since we had a little longer for this reading, I kind of compared Luke's to Matthew and Mark, and I found some interesting, and some things bothered me. For instance, when I read Luke here this time, and Jesus is entering Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, they don't throw down palm branches. They just throw down their cloaks in front of him. I go, wait a minute. And so I went back to Matthew and Mark, and of course, Matthew and Mark have that there. Luke doesn't. I found that interesting. But I also, when after the Last Supper, Luke says Jesus went up to the Mount of Olives. And I'm thinking, I thought he went to the Garden of Gethsemane. But I went back and looked at Matthew and Luke, and Matthew, I think, says he went to the garden. And I think Mark, I could get him backwards, said he went to Gethsemane. But so I, researched that a little further, and the best guess is they know where Mount of Olives are, because we, in fact, stood there.
Yeah.
But they're just guessing there was a garden of this, I say guessing, a garden of Gethsemane somewhere on the Mount of Olives. So I found that interesting. It's nice that we have all the Gospels to put this story together, and the story that we have is sometimes an amalgamation of all of them, and we don't realize that.
Yeah. Like, what we normally say is there was this guy who asked Jesus about the greatest commandment, and it's the rich young ruler. Well, in Luke, it's the rich man, and in Matthew, it's the young ruler. And so we put them together, right? Which is it makes sense. And sometimes it obscures that Luke is the gospel that talks most about money. And Matthew is really concerned with structures of power.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the stuff we do, I really appreciate that, because it's true. The Garden of Gethsemane is at the base of the Mount of Olives. So they can technically all be right.
Yes.
Even though they're doing it a little different. There's that parable, there's that story about the widow's mite. And usually we separate it from the verse that comes before it, because it's in a different chapter, which talks about the scribes devouring widows' homes. And then Jesus observes as women puts money in the treasury. And so the traditional read is, look at this lady, she gave everything she had. But if you connect the two, then there's a more insidious reading that actually kind of relates to the way we tend to do things. The only way you got temple welfare was when you had no thing whatsoever. So this lady's got money that's essentially worthless. Well, it's not enough to buy food with. And she can't have any food on the dole unless she gives everything away, which is humiliating. If you connect that too, it's wow, scribes, you've come up a way to give help to people in such a way that you strip their dignity, and this lady does that. So what I love is there's a lot of ambiguity, right? This lady could have given that money anywhere, and she chooses to give it to the very temple system that strips her dignity away, which might be a speak of her faith. It talks about proportional giving, right? There's that level. And then there's this also connection, to assist people, what do we require of them? And I struggle with this because people come and ask me for money, like they do at the church. And sometimes I just give it. In the past, I've given it. Now with Richard's help, I've developed an application process. And then there's this quote I read by Henri Nouwen. He says, sometimes we're called to be fools for Christ, which means giving people things they may not actually need. And there's a lot of tension in that, because I don't think there's always an either or. There's always context, and there's always, as much detail as we demand or examine, there's things we may not see. And the question is do we make it so hard that our default is no? And to me, the widow the widow story is like kind of about that. And Darlene's done a lot of this ministry as well, in terms of like evaluating and helping people get on firm financial footing, right? And it's just so complicated. I think that's the word, it's complicated.
Very.
I mean, I see these people out by HEB and they got the sign, right? And like, I don't always know what to do. I mean, I don't always know what to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I draw attention to when they talk about, are you the Son of God? And Jesus says, you say I am. That's become increasingly important to me in latter years, that instead of Jesus saying, yes, I am, he says, those are your words, not mine.
So how so?
Well, I guess for a couple of reasons, and forgive me, because this is probably like wrapping up a lot of thought into something that's not going to make any sense. But it occurs to me that there's this classic thing where we say there's these two natures of Jesus, like human and divine, that cohabitate at the same time. And like in my logical brain, the only way that works is if the divine nature never overpowers the human nature. So like if Jesus walked into a room of people he didn't know and he could read their minds, he wasn't a human being, because we can't do that. Like we have to deal with the anxiety of not knowing how people perceive us. And surely he did too. I mean, otherwise, right? He wouldn't have been human. Well, how does he work miracles? Well, the same way everybody else in the Bible does. Like God acts and he's involved in it, but like the power comes from God, not from him. I don't know if that makes sense, right? And so like it makes me think, well, if Jesus has both natures and he knows he's God, that would override his humanity. It almost seems like he can't have known that. Because if you knew you were God, you wouldn't be human anymore. And what Jesus uses is not Son of God. He says Son of Man, right? That's his phrase. You'll see the Son of Man. Like, I'm a human being born from human beings. A lot of people say, oh, it's an eschatological title, and Son of God really just means somebody who's blessed by God, and Son of Man really means like Son of God. But I want to disagree, because I think Luke's story is about like Jesus being on the plane with us and us being on the plane with each other, because the truth is we're all children of human beings. And in Luke's genealogy, that's because we're also all children of God, right? Like Adam is a child of God. That was a real complicated Christology I just put before you, but it starts to maybe say, to me, it's sort of like, to me, it's like Jesus telling these folk, and maybe telling us too, like, I don't know if you've heard this phrase, once you label me, you negate me. Like, don't wrap a box around me. Those are your words, not mine. I think part of it, to me, Ellen, too, is that like, I look at the irony, because we talk about Jesus as the King of Kings and like he's God and he's perfect. We don't do anything he talked about. There's sort of like, we have these major pictures of like Jesus being born with a crown, or like he's God, so we're gonna obey him and listen and pay him homage. But like, we don't do that. We don't love our neighbor very well. We don't love ourselves very well. So it's kind of like we give this like false obeisance. Hey, like, since you're the king and since you're perfect and you're untouchable, it'll never be like you. Thanks for doing all that stuff, instead of like, oh, you're inviting me into a way of life that you embodied. I don't know if that makes sense. I think sometimes we put Jesus on a pedestal to our peril, because if he's untouchable, it gets us off the hook.
Makes sense. And it's a question that I've pondered a lot, and so have great scholars, but I tend to think that Jesus was not aware of his divinity as he was growing up and as he was doing his ministry. Because like you say, then he would be God and we're off the hook.
You know, there's a lot of really interesting books that didn't make it into the Bible that are early, like they're written in the 2nd century about the boy Jesus who knew he was God, and man, he was a jerk. Like precocious isn't the right word, like arrogant, and treats people like just vessels, like to be cast away. Like one of my favorite story is he's playing hide and seek with his friends, and they all hide in the house, and he goes in and he hears them, and he asks the mom who's in there like making bread, like, hey, is that the kids? And she's like, oh no, those, you're just hearing the goats and the sheep. And like the 8-year-old Jesus is like, just as you said, so shall it be. And he turns all the kids into goats and sheep. Just like, what a brat. I mean, like, what a brat.
I killed him sooner.
Well, in there's a book that talks about all the scribes that came to teach the boy Jesus how to read, and they start like, hey, we're going to teach you your letters, and Jesus is like, well, can you tell me the mystery of the Alpha and the Omega? And of course, none of them can. And the kid's like 7. And then he like strikes them dumb. One of them he kills because they presumed to teach him. It's just sort of like, to me, in some ways, that's the logical conclusion of over-identifying with that like divine nature, right? It's like you're Superman, like you're an alien, instead of like, no, you're indigenous. I know it's a mystery, so like I don't want to try to solve it. To me, that's part of the tension, right? And like, when we say Jesus is like the king, like I don't see, the guy gives the sermon on the plain, not from the throne. Which makes me think we got perfection. We define perfection the wrong way, right? We say perfection's never making a mistake instead of learning from your mistakes. There was a really cool funeral here yesterday. The eulogist was actually kind of amazing, because most of the stories he told were of like an off-color nature. I don't mean like they were like lewd. I mean, they included this guy like tying a rope around his waist and like lowering him out of a window so he could like wash the windows, which is like not a best practice. Like that's a safety moment at LyondellBasell, right? Like tying a rope around your waist that's anchored to a chimney, not a good idea, right? And the guy did that stuff left and right, and the eulogist wasn't complaining about it. He was saying like, this was quirky and probably not safe, and I absolutely love this man. And it just sort of reminds me, like we don't love people despite their quirks. We love them because of their quirks. I mean, especially when they're gone. Like the things that drove us nuts, like that we found really annoying, we often miss those things when people aren't around, because like those are those moments that like where we got touched and rubbed, and sometimes it was irritating, but we got touched and rubbed. And so it's sort of like, you hear this a lot at funerals. I'm really going to miss this person like making this dumb joke that they made every time I saw them, because that's who they were. I don't know if that makes any sense.
I like the phrase you talked about, our thinking we need to be perfect, or Jesus was supposed to be perfect. I like the phrase perfectly imperfect.
Yeah. Well,
entirety. We are perfectly imperfect.
Yeah. We do this ourselves a disservice because the phrase isn't be perfect as I'm perfect, it's be holy as I am, right? And holiness is not about having no flaws. It's about being dedicated to something that's greater than ourselves. Herb, because you read the two together, I don't know if you noticed the centurion in Matthew says, surely this man was the son of a God. And in Luke, the centurion says, surely this man was innocent.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, I hope it's okay. You all are familiar with the phrase, surely this man was the son of God.
Yes.
Well, in Luke, and this shows up in 23, verse 47, when the centurion saw what had happened, he gave praise to God. Beyond all doubt, he said, this man was innocent. In Matthew, both of the people crucified with Jesus hurl insults at him. In Luke, one of them maybe has a conversion moment.
Yes.
Although, to be honest, we don't have tone when we read the Bible. We don't have tone. I'd invite you.
We don't have what?
We don't have tone in the dialogue. Like
yeah.
You could read this as sarcasm. This guy who has tried to raise a rebellion against Rome, that's why he's being crucified, says to another guy who's dying, remember me when you come into your kingdom. I mean, it could actually be an insult. And what's interesting is Jesus says, all right, instead of being insulted and angry, he says, all right. I hope God's like that for my sake. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, to think like actually maybe Matthew had it right, and this other brigand, right, is doing an insult, and Jesus is so gracious he declines being insulted. I didn't hear that in a sermon when I was a kid, but actually I think it's a lot better than what I heard, right? Because it's not dependent upon whether the thief has any real faith or not. It's dependent upon Jesus's faith in him, not his faith in Jesus. I hope that's right. Even if it's wrong, I think my life will be better if I choose to believe that. I think we do that for our spouses and our parents and our kids, right? Really, like, our hope in them is sometimes greater than their hope for themselves. I see that working like redemptively. Luke is the only gospel with the Emmaus story, right? It's the only one in which Jesus is revealed, not even in his teaching, but in a meal.
Sorry, what story are you referring to?
The walk to Emmaus, where like Clopas is leaving the city in despair and Jesus shows up and they don't recognize him.
Oh,
he walks with them, he explains the scriptures, and they still don't even know it's him. They don't know it's him until he shares a meal with them.
Yes. Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, you won't find it in the other three. All right, I'm over commenting. Darlene, was there anything you'd like to add?
No, it's been a good discussion this morning. I've enjoyed it.
Ellen?
I did like the story of the walk to Emmaus, because I like the reference to the table fellowship that we've been talking about, and how Jesus revealed himself then and not in other ways. So I did like that.
You know, in the Gospel of John, on Easter morning, right, Mary sees the resurrected Jesus and mistakes him for the gardener. And this is a different story, but it's interesting that these people who physically knew Jesus can't recognize him when he's right there. And that's really interesting to me, because it says like, hey, maybe we don't see the Lord because we've decided the Lord's not here. Or we're looking in particular ways, like we're looking very, very myopically instead of like broadly and more widely. And it's this interesting, like, I don't want to overdo this, but I had my mentoring rector, I was actually sort of pricked by this because it sort of came out of nowhere. He wasn't a real controversial preacher or anything like that, but he went to Sewanee. His dad was a priest, and he went to Sewanee, and after his first year, I think his GPA was 0.7. So his dad was like, hey, cool news, you're joining the military, you just pick which branch. Anyway, he ended up doing some time in the military, and then he came back, and he did graduate from Sewanee after all, and he turned his grades around or whatever. But to graduate from Sewanee, you did at the time have to complete calculus, even for a liberal arts degree. And lots of people grouse about calculus, but his takeaway was that calculus was a language. That at the end of the day, the calculus was like a language for interfacing with the universe. And what he said in the sermon, I remember, is like, that is the gift of the church, is we have language to interface with the world that will be beneficial to people. Like, that's what they need, is the language. And part of the language, right, is when we say like, we can never do it, and we can say like, oh, look, it's a miracle, it's double star day at Starbucks. But sometimes we reserve the language so much that it's not a gift to the world. You know, like we say miracles happen then, they don't happen now. Or we say, hey, Jesus was like holy in a way we can never be. And that starts to become so exclusive that it doesn't invite people to interact with the linguistic system. It turns it into a dead language. So like, I think we can overdo it. Like, I think I could say like, you know, wow, I had an epiphany when I tried Cool Ranch Doritos, because they're like really good, you know. And in some ways that might change my life, because I might buy that varietal of Dorito in the future instead of just nacho cheese. But I'm not really sure that's a substantive life change. But I can say, like, when I had a daughter, that was an epiphany. And usually that word epiphany is based in a manifestation of God. It's not just like a cool idea. And I'll tell you, having been a parent, and I think everybody on the screen agrees, you can never undo that epiphany. And I would tell you, even if for any reason, like my marriage failed and we got divorced, being married was an epiphany. Like, I will never be the same, even if I become unmarried. And I think sometimes, like, we get that there's like a substantive change, but the link is like that happens inside of God. Because like substantive change happens with like insight as to like where God is and like how we function inside of God within the world. And man, I think like that's a way of evangelism, is like, hey, that really meaningful thing like happened inside of God. So I don't think it's just words, but I do think there's this interesting bit that like words matter, and they matter because they help us like perceive what we're experiencing. And you know, increasingly I find that like, I'm just not interested in retreating to Bible stories. I'm interested in like fulfilling them and resonating with them, because that's a gift of language. You know, it's the gift that like, oh, this is my story. When we do the the day school Eucharist, I add the phrase, instead of "this is my body, do this in remembrance of me," it's "this is my body, all that I am, given to build you up. Whenever you eat bread, remember me." And when we do wine, we say, "This is my blood, my life force, given to nourish your life force. Whenever you drink wine, remember me." And, like maybe that overdoes one way of understanding the Eucharist. But I think it also takes the step of saying, let's move past the literal language into like what this is doing, or what we hope this is doing, or what we pray God is doing for us through these concrete actions. One other fun thing, just to point out the differences, if you're really interested in this, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus clearly eats a Passover meal with his disciples. Presumably that's on Thursday night, and then on Friday, right, it begins the Passover. In John, Jesus is crucified when the Passover lambs are being killed. Without realizing this, John has Jesus crucified on Thursday, and he doesn't have a Passover meal. He just has a regular meal. And a German scholar called Joachim Jeremias discovered this, like paid attention to read this carefully about 150 years ago. And it was kind of groundbreaking, because he was saying, like, it's not that the Gospels are arguing different fact patterns. Ostensibly they are, but what they're really doing is saying, like John's trying to say, Jesus is a Passover lamb, so he's with the lambs. But the surface read is they've got different days in mind, and they've got different meals in mind. You can do with that with what you want, but that's where a comparative study of the Gospels becomes interesting. Like in John, Jesus clears the temple in chapter 3. It's like the first thing he does. And in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's the first thing he does of the last week of his life. So you sort of say either he did it twice, or they've got the same story, but they're trying to give you a different depiction of what that story means.
How do they count the 3 days? Is the Passover meal the first day, or the day after that, the first day?
You mean when we talk about Easter?
Yes. Well, no, when we talk about this story we're reading here, where, he rose
3 days later. Yeah.
Yes.
So our Jewish brothers and sisters tell time from evening to morning, right?
Okay.
If you think about the story, Jesus gets killed on Friday sort of afternoon, and then the day turns over Friday night. So that's another day.
Okay.
And then the day turns over Saturday night, and that's how you get to 3.
Okay. So if he's eating the Passover meal
Thursday night.
That's Thursday night. And so Thursday night is the first day.
Yeah, and he dies that same day in Jewish time, right? Because
yes, because he dies at 3 p.m. the next day, but that's still
within the same Jewish day, right?
Yes. Yeah, okay.
So there's not 72 hours between cross and Easter.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
There's like 36 hours.
Okay. Yes.
But because of this different way of measuring the day, it's the third day.
Because it also says he rose the first day of the week. Somewhere, I think it says. And what day would that be?
Sunday.
It'll be Sunday. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because if you're Jewish, it's just so funny, right? I mean, Shabbat's the last day. Anyway. So the earliest Christians apparently did celebrate the Sabbath with their Jewish brothers and sisters, right, on Friday night through Saturday early evening. But then they also would have this potluck on Sunday morning.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things that like you hear and you say, but like when you get into the mechanics of it, it's like, wait a minute, that doesn't work.
Yeah, exactly.
But it does with the other system in mind,
Thank you.
Yeah. Let me just put this out. We did skip lesson 17 when we were going through, which is like a more general introduction. It's called Good News. Sorry, it's called Gospel. Now look, we've read everything in there except for 2 of the days. Right? It's about the early life and ministry of Jesus, and it's a broad chunk. Like read the first 9 chapters of Luke, and then read the next 10 chapters of Luke. So it's meant to be like a broad survey, and then it's sort of read all of Acts. So it's like a heavy reading. It's asking you to read Luke and Acts in a single week, all of it. We've done a more granular approach. Remember, we skipped that because we were going to do all of it again. But I don't know if you want to go back and do that, or if we want to move on to Acts next week, which would only ask us to read the first 5 chapters.
I think I'd like to move on to Acts and then maybe do this on our own.
Okay. Darlene, is that reasonable to you?
That sounds good to me.
Okay. Herb?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, so that'll be the plan, and you'll see it in the e-news that we'll do week 25 next week. And believe it or not, we are winding down. This is the last book, also presumably written by Luke. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your thoughts and your willingness to chase this out. Really appreciate, Herb, your willingness to stick with that story and think through, where we might be in it. I'm really grateful for that, because I know I put you on the spot.
Thank you.
Looking forward to seeing you before, if not next week. But again, grateful for our time together.
Likewise.
Okay. Hey, Mike.
Yes, sir.
In fact, the